It is the spring of 1992, and a Calvin Klein sample sale is being held in a midtown Manhattan showroom. The room is loud, crowded, bright with the particular fluorescence of commerce, dressed up as glamour. Women move between racks, publicists work the edges, and somewhere near the center of it, not quite participating, stands a young woman in her mid-20s who works in the sales division, who is, by any official measure, staff. A photographer raises a camera. She doesn't pose, she doesn't retreat. She holds whatever she was already doing, and the photograph, when it's developed, looks like something staged by a professional. That quality of being entirely composed, without appearing to try, would follow Carolyn Bessette for the rest of her life. It would open doors. It would also, in ways that took years to become visible, close others. She was not famous then. She was not a Kennedy. She was a young woman from Greenwich, Connecticut, who had arrived in New York with good instincts, excellent bone structure, and a particular gift for making people feel she belonged wherever she happened to be standing. What this story examines is the distance between that appearance and what it required to maintain it. The social mathematics behind the composure, the private cost of a life lived at the edge of other people's ambitions and appetites. First in the fashion world, then inside one of the most surveilled families in American history. This is not a story about tragedy. Exactly. It begins long before the tragedy. It begins in a town built on the performance of belonging, with a girl who learned very early exactly what that performance required. Greenwich, Connecticut sits at the southwestern edge of the state, close enough to New York City to feel its pull, but far enough to maintain the fiction of distance. In the 1970s and 1980s, it was one of the wealthiest municipalities in the United States. A town of hedge fund partners, old manufacturing money, and the particular American aristocracy that does not announce itself because it does not need to. The lawns were large. The conversations were careful. The social architecture was intricate and largely invisible to anyone who had not grown up inside it. Carolyn Bessette was born on January 7, 1966, in White Plains, New York. Her parents, William Bessette and Anne, divorced when Carolyn was still young. Her mother remarried, a man named Richard Freeman, an orthopedic surgeon, and the family relocated to Greenwich. By the time Carolyn entered middle school, she was living in a town that sorted people quietly and continuously, by address, by club membership, by the kind of car in the driveway, by the particular school attended and the particular families whose children attended it alongside you. The Freemans were comfortable. Her stepfather's profession placed them solidly in the professional class. But Greenwich had gradations that comfort alone could not bridge. There were families who had been there for generations, whose names appeared on buildings and donor walls, whose children socialized in a closed circuit that was polite but not permeable. And then there were families who were newer, whose money was recent or adjacent, who lived well but existed at a slight remove from the innermost rooms. Carolyn was a child in the second category who became, by adolescence, a person who moved as if she belonged in the first. This was not a small achievement. It required a kind of continuous social attention, a reading of rooms, of registers, of what was being communicated beneath what was being said. Her classmates at Greenwich High School would later describe her as magnetic, as someone who seemed to understand social situations faster than the people inside them. She was not the wealthiest girl in her class. She was something more useful in that particular environment. She was the one who seemed entirely at ease. Ease, in a town like Greenwich, is its own form of currency. It cannot be purchased directly. It can be performed, and performance sustained long enough begins to reshape the performer. What Carolyn was doing in those years was learning. She was learning which details mattered, the right tone of voice for a particular setting, the right degree of warmth that reads as genuine without becoming familiar, the precise social distance to maintain with people whose approval you need but cannot appear to need. These are skills that are rarely named because naming them would undermine their function. They operate best when invisible. Her mother, Anne Freeman, was by multiple accounts a formidable woman. Poised, socially fluent, with strong ideas about presentation and comportment. The household Carolyn grew up in was one where appearance and conduct were taken seriously, not as vanity, but as a form of competence. You dressed appropriately, you spoke well. You understood that how you moved through a room communicated something before you opened your mouth, and that communication was worth managing. This shaped Carolyn in ways that would not become fully legible until much later, when the stakes were higher and the rooms were larger. For now, it produced a teenager who was unusually self-possessed, who could walk into a party where she knew almost no one and find, within 20 minutes, the 2 or 3 people worth knowing, and be remembered by them afterward. She was also, by the accounts of people who knew her then, funny, not performing humor for social effect, but genuinely, privately funny, quick and dry and observational, most alive in small groups where the performance pressure dropped and she could simply respond to what was in front of her. This version of her, unguarded, sharp, comfortable, would become increasingly difficult to access as her life became more public, but it existed first, before any of the rest of it, in the smaller rooms. At Greenwich High School, she was well-liked without being universally known, attractive in a way that registered but did not define her socially the way it would later. She played field hockey. She had a close circle of friends. She was not, by the standard metrics, extraordinary. She was not valedictorian, was not editor of the school paper, did not accumulate the kind of formal achievements that look significant in retrospect. What she had was subtler and harder to quantify, a quality of presence and the intelligence to know how to use it. What she did not have in those years was a clear idea of what she wanted. Greenwich was a town with a very legible script for girls of her background, an approximate social position, college, the right social connections made there, marriage to someone appropriate, a life organized around that marriage. The script was unspoken, but universally understood. Most of the girls around her were, in one way or another, preparing to follow it. Carolyn was not opposed to the script. She simply had not yet decided whether it was hers. Her parents' divorce, the original rupture, before Greenwich, before Freeman, had left something that a comfortable remarriage could not entirely repair. People who divorce often believe they are protecting their children by providing stability afterward. What they cannot always provide is the thing that preceded the instability, the sense that the original structure was solid, that the foundation was trustworthy. Carolyn was young when her parents separated, young enough that the experience did not become a conscious narrative so much as a texture, a faint background hum of impermanence that a well-appointed house in Greenwich could muffle but not eliminate. She graduated from Greenwich High School in 1983 and enrolled at Boston University that fall in the School of Education. It was a reasonable choice, a respectable choice, the kind of choice that satisfied the people around her without fully committing her to anything. She was 18 years old. She was leaving a town that had taught her a great deal about how to move through the world, and she carried with her a set of skills that were genuinely valuable and entirely unexamined. The examination would come later, in Boston first, then New York, then eventually in circumstances that none of the people who knew her in Greenwich would have predicted or perhaps wished for her. Boston University in the mid-1980s was not Harvard, and it knew it. The campus stretched along Commonwealth Avenue in a long urban sprawl. No quad, no gates, no ivy. A school that drew ambitious students from middle and upper middle class families who wanted a serious education without the particular social filtration that the Ivy League required. It was, in its way, a more democratic environment than Greenwich. It was also, for that reason, a place where the social hierarchies were less fixed and therefore more actively contested. Carolyn arrived in the fall of 1983 as an education major. She lived in the dormitories, navigated the dining halls, attended the orientation events that all freshmen attend and most remember with a vague sense of having performed enthusiasm for strangers. She was 18, away from home for the first time, in a city that did not know her name or her stepfather's profession or which street she had grown up on. This anonymity was, depending on how you read her, either a relief or a problem, probably both. What happened at Boston University, and this is documented not through her own accounts, which are almost non-existent, but through the recollections of people who knew her there, is that Carolyn became gradually and then decisively known, not famous, not prominent in any official sense, but known in the way that certain people become known on college campuses, by a kind of social gravity, a quality that draws people toward them without any visible effort on their part. She changed her major from education, eventually settling on a degree that gave her more flexibility. She joined no clubs of particular note. She did not run for student government or write for the campus paper. What she did instead was develop a social life of unusual density, a wide circle of acquaintances, and a smaller, tighter group of friends who would remain loyal to her for years, some for decades. Her roommates and close friends from those years would later describe a person who was, in private, remarkably different from the composed figure the public would later construct. She was warm in a way that could feel almost overwhelming, attentive, remembering details about people's lives that they had mentioned only in passing, following up in ways that made people feel genuinely seen. She was also, in those same private accounts, anxious in ways she rarely showed. She cared about being liked, not in the ordinary way that most people care, but with an intensity that she had learned very precisely to conceal. The concealment was itself a kind of skill. In Greenwich, she had learned to perform ease. At Boston University, she refined it, learned to carry social anxiety as if it were simply alertness, to turn the energy of wanting approval into the appearance of effortless engagement. The result, to the people around her, looked like confidence. And confidence, in a college environment, compounds. People treat you as if you were certain of yourself, and the treatment eventually begins to shape the reality. She was also, by this point, strikingly beautiful, not in a girlish way, but in a way that had sharpened with age into something more structural, more arresting. This created its own complications. Beauty of that order in a social environment like a university functions as a kind of constant variable. It changes every interaction slightly, in ways that are difficult to account for and impossible to ignore. People responded to her before she spoke. Men pursued her with an intensity that was sometimes flattering and sometimes frightening. Women were occasionally wary, occasionally drawn to her with the same pull as everyone else. She navigated this with the same precision she applied to everything social, carefully, attentively, making it look as though she were not navigating at all. There were relationships. Details are scarce, protected by the privacy of people who knew her then and have largely declined to speak publicly. What is documented is a pattern. Carolyn was drawn to men who were confident, socially established, with a quality of certainty about themselves that she found, apparently, stabilizing. The relationships tended toward intensity. They also tended toward an uneven distribution of visibility. She present but secondary, the relationship organized around the other person's life and needs and social world. Whether she noticed this pattern then is not known. What is known is that she did not deviate from it for years. Her senior year, 1987, produced what her friends from that period describe as a shift, not dramatic, not marked by any single event, but a growing restlessness with the trajectory she was on. The education degree, the original plan of teaching, the life that Greenwich had scripted for her, none of it was holding. She was 21 years old, she was about to graduate, and she was watching the people around her make decisions. Graduate school, law school, engagements, jobs in finance, that felt to her, from the accounts that survive, like a kind of closing. She did not want to close. She wanted something that she could not yet name precisely, which is perhaps the most accurate description of Carolyn Bessette at 21. A person of significant capability and genuine charm, standing at the edge of a life that fit her requirements on paper and none of her instincts in practice. New York was the answer that occurred to her, as it occurs to a particular kind of ambitious young person from the Northeast who has not yet decided what they are ambitious for. It was close enough to Greenwich to feel like known territory, and different enough to feel like escape. It had fashion and finance and media and the particular ecosystem of people who had come from everywhere to become something. She graduated in 1988. The year is documented, the ceremony unrecorded in any surviving photograph that has surfaced publicly, and moved to the city. She found an apartment. She began, as young women with her particular combination of appearance and social intelligence often did in that specific moment of New York, to look for work in fashion. What she found eventually was Calvin Klein, and Calvin Klein found in her something it had not quite been looking for, but immediately recognized. Calvin Klein, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, was not simply a fashion house. It was a machine for producing desire, not for clothing exactly, but for a particular idea of what clothing could make you. The advertisements were minimal, the aesthetic was austere, and the effect was one of studied cool. The suggestion that the people who wore these clothes had arrived at some elevated plateau of taste and self-possession where nothing needed to be explained or justified. It was an enormously effective illusion, and it required, to sustain it, people who could embody it in person. Carolyn joined the company around 1988, initially in a junior sales position. She was not hired as a model, a distinction that mattered in ways both practical and psychological. Models were interchangeable, rotated, replaced when the aesthetic required it. Sales staff, particularly those who worked directly with clients, with buyers, with the ecosystem of people whose goodwill translated into commercial relationships, occupied a different position. They were the human infrastructure of the brand. They were paid to make people feel something, and what they were paid to make people feel was that Calvin Klein understood them. Carolyn was exceptionally good at this. Her managers noticed quickly. Within a relatively short period, she had moved from junior sales into a role that put her in direct contact with the company's most important clients: celebrities, magazine editors, buyers from the major department stores, the social figures whose visibility functioned as a form of unpaid advertising. She was, in the language of the industry, a people person, but that phrase flattens what she was actually doing, which was more precise and more demanding than it sounds. What Carolyn understood intuitively, and then with increasing sophistication, was that the people who came to Calvin Klein were not shopping for clothes in any simple sense. They were shopping for confirmation of their taste, their status, their self-image. They wanted to be handled by someone who recognized their significance without appearing to be impressed by it. Too much deference read as insecurity. Too little read as indifference. The register Carolyn maintained was narrow and exact, warm without being servile, knowledgeable without being pedantic, beautiful in a way that complemented rather than competed with the client's own self-presentation. This required her to be, in a precise sense, selfless in the room, not invisible. Her presence was part of what she was selling, but organized entirely around the other person's needs and perceptions. It was the Greenwich skill set, professionalized and deployed in an environment where it generated measurable results. She rose steadily. By the early 1990s, she was working as a publicist and personal shopper for the house, a role that put her at the intersection of fashion, media, and the social world that connected them. She attended the events, the shows, the dinners. She knew which photographers to manage and how to manage them. She knew which editors needed to feel important and which needed to feel included and which needed to feel that they had discovered something themselves. She operated, in short, at the exact center of the image machinery. And she did so with a composure that the machinery itself could not have manufactured. The industry noticed her in the way it notices people it cannot quite categorize. She was not a designer. She was not a model, though she was frequently mistaken for one. She was not an editor or a journalist. She was something more slippery, a person who understood the system deeply enough to move through it without being fully consumed by it, or appearing to be. This appearance was, by this point, partly genuine and partly maintenance. The private Carolyn, the one her friends from Boston and from her early New York years still accessed occasionally in late evenings in small apartments, was more complicated than the figure she projected at work. She was thinking harder about the industry than most of the people inside it, and what she thought was not always flattering to the institution or to herself. She understood that the thing being sold was largely fiction, that the aspiration Calvin Klein trafficked in was precisely calibrated to remain just out of reach, that the people whose job was to embody the brand were in the end instruments of someone else's vision. She was an instrument that knew it was an instrument. Whether that knowledge was protective or corrosive depended on the day. Her personal life in these years was organized around a rhythm that would become familiar. Intensive work, a close but small social circle, and relationships conducted largely outside public view. One relationship from this period, with the model Michael Bergen, would later become public knowledge, largely because Bergen wrote about it himself. By the accounts that exist, including Bergen's own, the relationship was serious, emotionally significant for both of them, and conducted with the discretion that Carolyn applied to everything personal. She did not discuss it at work. She did not perform it socially. It existed in the part of her life she kept separate from the part that was visible. The separation was becoming harder to maintain. By the early 1990s, Carolyn's name was circulating in New York social circles in a way it hadn't before. Not because she sought it, but because the people around her were increasingly visible, and she was increasingly present in the rooms where visible people gathered. Photographers at industry events began to seek her out specifically. Her image appeared in the background of photographs intended to document other people, then increasingly in the foreground. Calvin Klein himself was aware of her in the way that the heads of image-driven companies are aware of people who embody what the company is trying to project. She was, in a sense, the brand's best advertisement, not because she wore the clothes, but because she had internalized more completely than almost anyone around her the particular quality of self-possession the brand was selling. What the brand could not account for, and what no one in that environment was positioned to ask about, was what it costs a person to sustain that quality continuously. What gets used up in the maintenance of composure. What happens to the private self when the public self is that precisely constructed? These were not questions the fashion industry asked. They were not questions Carolyn asked aloud, at least not in any record that survives, but they were accumulating, quietly, in the years before she met John Kennedy. New York in the early 1990s was a city in the middle of a particular kind of transformation. The excess of the previous decade was contracting. Real estate had softened, the financial sector was recalibrating, the social world that had organized itself around conspicuous expenditure was becoming, at least superficially, more restrained. Fashion, however, was not contracting. Fashion was in one of its periodic explosions, driven by the emergence of supermodels as cultural figures, by the globalization of luxury brands, by the increasingly porous boundary between the industry and celebrity culture. The rooms Carolyn moved through were full of people who were becoming famous or adjacent to fame, and the social atmosphere carried the particular charge of a world in the process of remaking its own rules. She was in her mid-20s, established enough at Calvin Klein to have real access, young enough that the access still felt provisional. She lived in Manhattan, in an apartment that was, by the accounts of people who visited, spare and carefully arranged, the home of someone who understood that objects communicate, who had chosen each thing deliberately and placed it with attention. It was not a wealthy person's apartment. It was something more considered than that. The home of someone who had absorbed the aesthetic vocabulary of her professional environment and applied it to her private life with the same precision she applied to everything else. Her friendships from this period were close and largely private. She maintained connections with people from Boston, from Greenwich, and had built a new circle in New York, a mix of people in fashion, in media, in the loosely defined creative world that overlapped with both. The friendships were intense and loyal in the way that the friendships of people who guard their privacy tend to be, built on genuine trust, maintained with real effort, and kept strictly separate from the professional world. The men she was involved with in these years fit a pattern that is only visible in retrospect, because at the time each relationship appeared singular and self-contained. They tended to be older or more publicly established, or both. They had a quality of certainty about themselves, about their place in the world, that Carolyn, for all her composure, apparently found necessary. They were also, consistently, men whose lives had a public dimension that hers did not, which meant that in each relationship she was the private half of a public-private equation that placed her permanently in the background. Michael Bergen entered her life sometime in the early 1990s. He was a model, tall, dark, with the kind of uncomplicated physical presence that the industry required and rewarded, and their relationship, by his own later account, was the central emotional fact of his life for several years. He described Carolyn as unlike anyone he had known, not in the cliché sense that people used to describe ex-lovers in memoirs, but specifically. Her intelligence, her humor, her capacity for intimacy in private settings that was entirely invisible in public ones. What Bergen's account also describes, between the lines of his evident feeling for her, is the structure of the relationship, that it was conducted almost entirely on her terms of privacy, that she controlled what was visible and what was not, and that this control was not negotiated so much as simply maintained as a condition of her participation. She would not be photographed with him at industry events. She did not introduce him to the colleagues she kept separate from her personal life. The relationship existed in its own compartment, complete and real inside its walls, invisible from outside them. Whether this was protection or avoidance is a question the available record cannot answer. Both things can be true simultaneously, and in Carolyn's case, they probably were. She had grown up in an environment that taught her that visibility is a resource to be managed, not given freely. She had spent her professional life in an industry that commodified appearance to the point where privacy felt like the only form of genuine possession. To keep her personal life out of the professional sphere was, on one reading, simply intelligent. On another reading, it was the behavior of someone who had learned so thoroughly to control her own image that she had begun to apply the same control to her own emotional life, managing intimacy the way she managed everything else, precisely and from a slight distance. The relationship with Bergen ended, as such relationships do, not in a single moment, but in the gradual accumulation of incompatibilities that intensity alone cannot resolve. He has described the ending as painful, prolonged, not fully resolved. Even after it was officially over, Carolyn moved forward in the way she moved through most difficult things, without public evidence of difficulty. There were other men, less documented, filling the years of her mid to late 20s. What the available record suggests is that none of them occupied the full space of her life, that she maintained always reserves of herself that were not given over, that the compartmentalization that protected her also limited the degree to which any relationship could fully take hold. In 1992 or 1993, the exact timing is disputed in different accounts. She met John F. Kennedy, Jr. The meeting occurred in a professional context, at or around a Calvin Klein event, in the way that most meetings in that social world occurred, sideways, casually, without the weight of significance that retrospect would assign to it. He was, by that point, one of the most publicly recognized men in the United States. He had grown up in the most photographed family in American history, had spent his entire life as a subject of public attention, and had developed in response a quality of ease with visibility that was the precise inverse of Carolyn's quality of ease with privacy. She would have read this immediately. She read rooms faster than anyone around her, and John Kennedy was not a difficult room to read. He was warm, charismatic, accustomed to being the most significant person present, and entirely comfortable with that status. What he was not accustomed to was someone who did not reorganize themselves around it. Carolyn did not reorganize. She was with him exactly what she was with everyone, composed, attentive, slightly withheld. It was, in the context of his experience, genuinely unusual. And unusual for a man who had been treated as extraordinary his entire life was its own form of attraction. The relationship that followed would take years to become what it eventually became. In those early years, it was something quieter, a connection forming between two people who had both, in different ways, spent their lives performing a version of themselves for an audience, and who recognized in each other the gap between the performance and the person. What neither of them could have known in those early meetings was that closing that gap would not become easier as they came closer together. It would become harder. John F. Kennedy, Jr. had never lived a private life. This is not a figure of speech. From the moment his father was assassinated in November 1963, when John was 2 years old, he had existed as a public object, photographed, discussed, analyzed, projected upon. The image of him saluting his father's coffin became one of the most reproduced photographs of the 20th century. He grew up inside that image, alongside it, permanently attached to it in ways that no amount of ordinary living could dissolve. By the time he met Carolyn, he had spent 3 decades managing the consequences of that inheritance. He had attended Phillips Academy, Brown University, and New York University School of Law. He had failed the New York bar exam twice before passing on his 3rd attempt. A failure that the press covered with an appetite that said more about the public's relationship to the Kennedy mythology than it did about John himself. He had worked as an assistant district attorney in Manhattan. He was, by the early 1990s, preparing to launch a political magazine called George. He was, by virtually every account of people who knew him, genuinely likable, curious, self-deprecating, physically at ease in the world. In the way that people who have been watched their entire lives sometimes become as a form of adaptation. He was also, and this matters for what followed, entirely unequipped to offer the person he was with a life outside public attention. Not because he was careless or selfish, and the accounts of people who knew him suggest neither, but because public attention was the medium he had always lived in. It was not something he turned on and off. It was the permanent condition of his existence, the air pressure of his world, and he had long since stopped registering it as unusual. Carolyn registered it immediately and continuously. This was the fundamental asymmetry at the center of what they were building together. Their relationship in the early years, roughly 1993 to 1995, was conducted with a level of secrecy that required active effort from both of them, but primarily from Carolyn. John was recognized everywhere he went in New York. A dinner together, a walk in the park, a taxi ride across town. Each ordinary act carried the possibility of a photograph, of a caption, of a public narrative being written about them before they had written it themselves. Carolyn understood this and responded by making herself, in those shared spaces, as unreadable as possible. She did not perform the relationship. She did not acknowledge photographers. She moved alongside John with the same composure she brought to everything, and the composure read in the photographs that occasionally surfaced as mystery. The press found her mysterious because she declined to be legible. This was not a strategy exactly. It was a disposition, the natural expression of everything Greenwich and Calvin Klein had taught her about the value of controlled visibility. But the effect was to make her, in the public imagination, into something slightly unreal, a figure of extraordinary beauty and complete opacity, attached to the most eligible man in America, giving nothing away. Inside the relationship, the accounts that survive suggest something more complicated and more human. Friends of both describe a genuine connection, intellectually, emotionally, and also a persistent tension around the question of what kind of life they were building and for whom. John's appetite for public engagement was not simply professional. He enjoyed people, enjoyed rooms, enjoyed the particular energy of being known and welcomed. Carolyn's version of a good evening was smaller, a dinner with people she trusted, a conversation that went somewhere real. The absence of performance pressure. These were not irreconcilable differences in ordinary circumstances. In their circumstances, they were structural. By 1995, the relationship had deepened to the point where the question of its future was unavoidable. John was moving forward with George, which would launch in September of that year. The magazine was explicitly political and cultural, designed to occupy the intersection of those two worlds, and its existence would require John to be publicly active in ways that exceeded even his existing visibility. He would give interviews. He would attend events. He would, in short, become more public at precisely the moment when Carolyn, if she stayed with him, would become public too. She stayed. The decision is not documented. There is no letter, no recorded conversation in which she weighs the options and chooses. What is documented is the fact of her continued presence, the deepening of the relationship through 1995, the move towards something more permanent that both of them were apparently, if cautiously, pursuing. What is also documented in the accounts of people close to them during this period is that Carolyn began experiencing what multiple friends described as anxiety about the future. Not about John specifically, but about the shape of the life that John's existence made inevitable. She asked questions that her friends found difficult to answer. What it would mean to give up the career she had built, whether a public life could coexist with the private self she had always protected, whether love of this particular kind came with terms that could be negotiated or whether the terms were fixed by circumstances neither of them had chosen. Her friends, by these accounts, told her what friends generally tell each other in such moments, that it would work out, that she was capable of handling it, that John was worth whatever adjustment was required. These were kind things to say. They were not necessarily accurate. What was accumulating in those conversations and in the private space of Carolyn's own thinking was a set of concerns that had no clean resolution. She was 30 years old. She had spent her adult life constructing a self that was entirely hers, private, controlled, genuine in its intimacy, and disciplined in its public presentation. John Kennedy was asking her, not deliberately, but structurally, to hand a significant portion of that self over to a public that had no interest in her complexity and every interest in her image. She knew this. She went forward anyway, in the way that people go forward when the feeling is strong enough to override the knowledge, not in ignorance of the cost, but in the belief or the hope that the feeling would prove worth it. The engagement came in 1996, and with it, everything that the previous years of careful management had been holding back arrived at once. The ring was an antique, a thin band of gold set with a single diamond, understated in the way that things chosen by people with genuine taste tend to be understated. John had it designed by John Hartman, a jeweler, based on a sketch he had made himself. The gesture was private, personal, the kind of thing that does not survive contact with the tabloid press, which received it, when the engagement became known, as simply another data point in the ongoing public narrative of John F. Kennedy Jr.'s romantic life. The proposal happened in the fall of 1995, though the engagement was not publicly confirmed until much later. For a period of months, Carolyn and John existed in the strange intermediate space of people who have made a private commitment that the world has not yet been informed of. Knowing what was coming, attempting to extend the quiet for as long as possible, she continued working at Calvin Klein. He continued with George. They moved through their separate professional lives with the knowledge between them, unannounced, a form of shared privacy that would not last. It did not last because nothing in John Kennedy's life remained private for long. The machinery of public attention that had surrounded him since childhood had by the mid-1990s become more sophisticated and more aggressive. The celebrity press had expanded dramatically through that decade. More magazines, more television programs devoted to the coverage of public figures, and crucially, more photographers operating independently, selling images to the highest bidder rather than working within the older, more regulated relationships between publications and subjects. The paparazzi economy was at a particular peak of intensity in the mid-1990s, and John Kennedy was among its most valuable subjects. When the engagement became known, through the channels by which such things become known, a combination of deliberate leak, social circulation, and the inevitable failure of secrecy in a city as densely networked as New York, the response was immediate and total. Carolyn Bessette, who had spent years moving through the edges of public attention with careful invisibility, found herself at its center overnight. The coverage was, from the first days, organized around a question that said everything about how she would be treated for the rest of her public life. Who is she? The question was not asked with genuine curiosity. It was asked with the particular appetite of a press that had decided she was significant because of her proximity to John, and that her significance could be fully captured by her appearance, her background, and her relationship to the Kennedy family. She was described in terms that recycled and amplified each other across dozens of publications. Beautiful, mysterious, stylish, unknown. The descriptions told the reader almost nothing about the actual person and everything about what the press required her to be. She gave no interviews. This was consistent with everything she had always done, but in the new context of her public status it was read differently. As aloofness, as calculation, as evidence of a personality that was, depending on the publication, either intimidatingly sophisticated or worryingly cold. The silence that had been her primary form of self-protection became, in the tabloid narrative, a character flaw. The photographers arrived in force. Outside her apartment building in the West Village, outside the Calvin Klein offices, outside restaurants where she had lunch with friends. They were there, multiple times a day, every day, with the patience and the persistence of people who understood that their income depended on her image and that she had not yet found a way to make herself unavailable to them. She varied her routes. She used back exits. She wore sunglasses and hats and kept her head down. None of it was sufficient. The photographs appeared regardless, in publications that reached millions of readers, and in each photograph she looked exactly as she always looked. Composed, unreachable, beautiful in a way that reproduced perfectly on a magazine page. The Calvin Klein years had prepared her, in theory, for the mechanics of image management. What they had not prepared her for was the loss of agency over her own image. The shift from someone who understood and managed visibility to someone who was simply visible, continuously, and without consent. At Calvin Klein, she had been on the producing side of the image machinery. Now she was its subject, and the machinery did not distinguish between willing and unwilling subjects. It processed what it was given. Her friends from this period describe a change that was gradual but visible to the people close to her. She became more careful in public, more controlled, more watchful, in ways that went beyond her already considerable self-discipline. She stopped doing things that carried risk of being photographed in an unguarded moment. The spontaneous walk, the outdoor lunch, the errand that took her through busy streets without a plan. Her world, which had always been carefully bounded, became more so. The apartment in the West Village became a refuge in a way it had not been before. Not a home so much as a withdrawal point, the only space where the cameras could not follow. John's response to all of this was, by the accounts of people who observed them together, genuine and limited. He was sympathetic. He understood intellectually that what Carolyn was experiencing was disproportionate and unfair, that she had not sought public life and was being subjected to its most aggressive forms without having made any of the choices that typically precede that exposure. He tried to manage the photographers when they were together. He spoke to people at the publications whose coverage he found most invasive. What he could not do was make it stop. The attention was not attached to anything he had done recently or anything that could be undone. It was structural, the permanent condition of being a Kennedy, now extended to include the person a Kennedy had chosen to marry. Carolyn had understood this intellectually before the engagement. Understanding it intellectually and living inside it were different experiences entirely. The wedding was being planned through all of this, in the compressed and pressured atmosphere of two people trying to make a private decision in a world that had decided their decisions were public property. The guest list was kept small. The location was kept secret. Every detail was managed with the kind of operational care that should not be necessary for a wedding, but had become necessary for this one. The location they chose was Cumberland Island, off the coast of Georgia. Remote, accessible only by ferry, with a small church called the First African Baptist Church that seated fewer than 100 people. It was as far from the center of things as they could reasonably get, and still not far enough. Cumberland Island is the largest of Georgia's barrier islands, separated from the mainland by the Cumberland Sound, and accessible only by a ferry that runs twice daily. In September 1996, it was home to a few dozen permanent residents, a national seashore, and the ruins of a Carnegie family estate called Dungeness, a gutted shell of Gilded Age ambition, its walls still standing but its interior open to the sky, overtaken by vines and salt air. The island had the quality of a place that had outlasted its own purpose, and it was here, in a small white wooden church at the northern end of the island, that Carolyn Bessette and John F. Kennedy, Jr. were married on the evening of September 21st, 1996. The church, the First African Baptist Church, was founded in 1893 by freed slaves and their descendants. It seated approximately 70 people. The pews were plain wood. There was no electricity. The ceremony was conducted by candlelight, which was not an aesthetic choice so much as a practical consequence of the building's age and simplicity. The guests, fewer than 40 by most accounts, had been transported to the island under conditions of deliberate obscurity, told only what they needed to know, kept separated from the logistical details that might, if they circulated, find their way to a reporter. Carolyn wore a dress designed by Narciso Rodriguez, a young designer who was a friend. It was silk crepe, slip-cut, almost monastic in its simplicity. A dress that made no gestures toward traditional bridal spectacle and instead trusted entirely to line and fit. It was exactly the kind of choice she would make. Nothing extraneous, nothing performed, the aesthetic stripped to what was essential. Rodriguez had not yet achieved the prominence the dress would bring him. After the photographs appeared, his career changed permanently. John wore a dark suit, no tie. His hair was slightly longer than it had been in recent photographs. He looked, in the images that were eventually published, like someone who was genuinely happy, not performing happiness for a camera, but experiencing it, which in his case was a distinction worth noting. The ceremony lasted approximately half an hour. A cousin of John's played the violin. There were readings. The candles threw uneven light across the plain wooden walls. Outside, the Georgia night was warm and thick with the particular silence of an island, where there are no roads and no cars, and the only sound is the marsh and the water. No press was present, no photographers. The 40-odd guests were the entirety of the world that witnessed it, which was, by the standards of John F. Kennedy Jr.'s life, an almost incomprehensible privacy. It lasted approximately 3 days. The first photographs appeared on September 24th, sold by a guest or a source adjacent to the event to a wire service, and from there distributed instantaneously to every major publication in the world. The images showed Carolyn in the Rodriguez dress, John in his dark suit, the small white church behind them, the Georgia trees. They were, as photographs go, beautiful. The candlelight, the simplicity, the evident feeling between the two people in the frame. They were also a violation of everything the wedding had been designed to protect. The coverage that followed was total. Every major newspaper ran the photographs on the front page. Television news programs led with them. The fashion press focused on the dress, its designer, its construction, its implications for bridal fashion, with an intensity that treated a private garment as a public artifact. Narciso Rodriguez gave interviews. The island's ferry operators gave interviews. People who had not been present gave interviews about what they had heard from people who had. Carolyn gave no interviews. This was noted in several publications as significant, as if her silence in the immediate aftermath of the most photographed moment of her life were evidence of something worth analyzing, rather than the entirely reasonable response of a person who had just had her wedding turned into a media event against her wishes. What the coverage also produced, and what would prove more durable than any individual article, was a set of images that fixed Carolyn in the public imagination in a specific and permanent way. The dress, the hair, loose, slightly undone, the most unguarded she had appeared in any photograph since her engagement became public. The expression, not quite a smile, not quite the composed neutrality she maintained in most public photographs, but something in between, a quality of guarded happiness that read, depending on the viewer, as either radiance or reserve. These images did not show a person. They showed an icon, and the icon, once established, would prove extraordinarily difficult to dislodge or to live alongside. Within weeks of the wedding, Carolyn had effectively ceased to be a private citizen in any practical sense. The apartment in the West Village was now a known address, photographed in establishing shots for television segments, mentioned in articles as if its location were public property. Her movements, to the grocery store, to friends' apartments, to the gym, were tracked and reported with an attention to detail that had previously been reserved for heads of state. She had become, in the parlance of the celebrity press, a get, a figure whose image commanded premium prices, whose rare unguarded moments were worth significant money to the person who captured them. She had also, in the same period, left Calvin Klein. The departure was framed in the limited coverage it received as a natural transition, the new Mrs. Kennedy stepping back from her career to take on the responsibilities of her new life. Whether this framing was accurate, whether it was her choice or a consequence of the impossibility of maintaining a professional life under the level of attention she was now receiving, is not fully documented. What is documented is the absence. The career she had built over nearly a decade, the professional identity that had been entirely hers, was gone within months of the wedding. What replaced it was not, as the press framing suggested, a life of Kennedy responsibilities and social engagements. What replaced it was something considerably less legible, a life organized around managing an attention that could not be satisfied and protecting a privacy that could not be fully maintained, inside an apartment in the West Village, where the candles burned because she had always preferred them to overhead light, and the phone rang with people wanting things she had not decided to give. There is a photograph taken sometime in 1997 at a public event in New York that circulated widely in the celebrity press at the time and has been reproduced many times since. Carolyn is standing slightly apart from a group, not isolated, not awkward, but separate in the way she had always been separate in public spaces, contained within her own composure. She is dressed impeccably. Her expression is the one she had refined over years of professional life, attentive, pleasant, giving nothing specific away. John is nearby, engaged with someone, his body angled outward toward the room in the way that people who are comfortable with public attention naturally orient themselves. The photograph is unremarkable by the standards of celebrity coverage. What it documents, without intending to, is the structural reality of her new life. She is present, She is visible, and she is entirely peripheral to the event she is attending. She is there because John is there. She is photographed because he is photographed. In the caption, her name follows his, introduced by the word wife. She was 31 years old. She had, until 18 months earlier, held a senior position at one of the most significant fashion houses in the world. She had built, over nearly a decade, a professional identity that was entirely her own, not inherited, not attached to anyone else's name, but generated by her own competence and intelligence and the specific skills she had developed through years of careful work. That identity was now effectively suspended, filed away in the recent past, referenced occasionally in press profiles as background detail, formerly of Calvin Klein, before the profiles moved on to what the press considered the more significant information: her measurements, her diet, her relationship with the Kennedy family. The transition from professional to public wife is not in itself unusual. Many women have made it, across many eras, under varying degrees of pressure and choice. What made Carolyn's version of it particular was the speed and totality of the transformation and the specific quality of the public life she had entered, one that offered maximum visibility and minimum agency, that required her continuous presence without providing any defined role, any function, any reason to be present beyond the fact of the marriage itself. She was not a politician's wife with campaign responsibilities, constituent meetings, a defined public function that would structure her days and give her absence and her presence meaning. She was not a businesswoman using her new prominence to advance her own ventures. She was, in the terms the public and press had settled on, a Kennedy wife. A category with historical precedence and cultural weight, but no specific job description, organized entirely around the social and professional needs of the man she had married. John's life in this period was structured and purposeful. George magazine was publishing, requiring his attention, his public presence, his continuous advocacy. He had political ambitions that, by the accounts of people close to him, were becoming more concrete. A Senate seat in New York was discussed, a future that would have required exactly the kind of disciplined public engagement he was already practicing. His days had shape and direction. Hers, by the accounts of her friends from this period, increasingly did not. She attempted to find footing in the new landscape. There were discussions documented in the accounts of people around her about potential projects, design consulting, involvement with charitable organizations, a possible return to some form of professional work. None of these materialized into anything sustained. The difficulty was partly structural. The level of press attention she received made ordinary professional activity nearly impossible, since any workplace she entered would immediately become a location for photographers, and any project she attached her name to would be covered primarily as a Kennedy story rather than as anything she had generated herself. But the difficulty was also internal, and this is where the accounts of her friends become more careful and more significant. She was, by multiple descriptions from people who saw her regularly in 1997 and 1998, struggling with something that went beyond the practical inconveniences of her new life. The self-discipline that had always been her primary instrument. The composure, the control, the ability to present exactly what she chose to present, and nothing else, was under the continuous pressure of her new circumstances, requiring more maintenance than it had previously. The effort was showing not to strangers, not to the press, but to the people who had known her before. Her sleep was disrupted. She had, by some accounts, lost weight in ways that concerned people close to her. She smoked. She had smoked for years. It was not new, but the frequency increased. She was, in the language people use when they are being careful about a friend they are worried about, not herself. The apartment in the West Village remained the center of her life in a way that was, by this point, less a preference than a necessity. Going out meant photographers. Photographers meant images. Images meant captions. Captions meant the ongoing public construction of a Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy, who bore a narrowing relationship to the person actually living in that apartment. She had always valued her private space. Now the distinction between private and public had become the central organizing fact of her existence, and the private space was shrinking. Her relationship with the Kennedy family was, by the accounts available, cordial but not close. She had met and spent time with various family members, had navigated the particular social world of Kennedy gatherings, which combined the ordinary dynamics of a large and complicated family with the extraordinary pressure of a dynasty that regarded itself, and was regarded by others, as a public institution. She was an outsider in that world, not unwelcome, but not entirely legible to a family whose internal culture had been formed by decades of shared experience and shared grief that she had not been part of. The family had its own mythology, its own language, its own expectations. Caroline Kennedy, John's sister, was gracious. The extended family was large and various, but the world Carolyn had married into had been in formation for 50 years before she arrived, and the place she occupied in it had been defined by others long before she got there. The name she now carried, Bessette-Kennedy, hyphenated, the hyphen itself a kind of record of what had been joined and what had been retained, was both the most recognizable thing about her and the least representative. It opened rooms and closed others. It answered questions about who she was in a way that made further questions seem unnecessary. She was 31, then 32. The career was gone. The privacy was gone. The composure held, in public, with the consistency of something that has been practiced for so long it has become involuntary. What it cost to hold it was by now visible only to the people close enough to see what was underneath. George launched in September 1995, 14 months before the wedding, with a cover featuring Cindy Crawford dressed as George Washington, powdered wig, colonial coat, bare midriff, and a print run of approximately 500,000 copies. The issue sold out. The press coverage of the launch was substantial, driven partly by genuine curiosity about whether a celebrity-backed political magazine could find an audience, and partly by the ongoing public fascination with John Kennedy Jr. himself. The two things were inseparable from the beginning, which was both the magazine's greatest commercial asset and its most significant structural problem. John had co-founded George with Michael Berman, a political consultant, and the magazine's stated ambition was to cover politics the way entertainment magazines covered entertainment, with personality, with access, with an understanding that the people making policy were as interesting, as flawed, and as human as the people making films. It was a genuine editorial idea, not simply a vanity project, and John brought to it a real intelligence and a real belief that political engagement could be made accessible to people who found conventional political journalism alienating. He was, by the accounts of people who worked at the magazine, a good editor in the ways that matter most. Curious, open to ideas that were not his own, willing to have his instincts challenged by people who knew more about specific subjects than he did. He could be indecisive, and the magazine's editorial identity was never as sharp as its founding concept suggested it could be, but the working environment was, by most accounts, genuinely collaborative and relatively free of the ego that typically surrounds celebrity-driven enterprises. What it required, however, was his continuous public presence. Every issue needed promoting. Every controversy the magazine generated, and it generated several, including a 1997 piece that criticized members of his own family for their political conduct, which produced a public dispute with his cousin Joseph Kennedy II, needed managing. Every interview he gave pulled the conversation inevitably back to his family, his name, his future political ambitions, and his marriage. John had, over his lifetime, developed a sophisticated relationship with public attention. He could modulate it, redirect it, use it for specific purposes, and deflect it when it was unhelpful. What he could not do was turn it off. The magazine's offices were on Broadway, in a building that became, for the duration of George's existence, a location that photographers monitored. John arrived and departed under the same conditions that governed the rest of his life: documented, tracked, captured. This was ordinary to him. It was not ordinary to Carolyn, who was not an employee of the magazine, had no official role there, and yet found that her proximity to it, because of her proximity to John, made her subject to the same surveillance. She attended the launch events, the promotional gatherings, the occasional George-related dinner or reception. In each of these settings, she performed the role that the occasion required: supportive, present, appropriate. She was good at it in the mechanical sense. She knew how to dress for these events, how to conduct herself, how to represent the marriage in the social terms that John's professional life demanded. But the accounts of people who observed her at these events describe someone who was present in the way that a person can be physically present while being somewhere else entirely, attending, performing, and privately elsewhere. Her own ambitions, to the extent that they had survived the transition from professional life to public wifehood, found no outlet in the George world. Fashion, the field she had actually spent a decade building expertise in, was not George's territory. The magazine operated in a world of political figures, Washington insiders, cultural commentators, a world in which Carolyn's specific knowledge and experience were largely irrelevant. She was visible at George events not because of anything she brought to the magazine, but because of who she had married, which was precisely the condition she had spent her adult life working to avoid. The friction between them, documented in the accounts of friends, colleagues, and the occasional journalist who had genuine access to their social world rather than simply to their public appearances, was not primarily personal in the way that the tabloid press framed it. It was not simply two people with difficult personalities failing to get along. It was structural. Two people with fundamentally different relationships to public life, trying to build a shared life in a context that relentlessly amplified those differences. John needed visibility for his professional project. George could not exist without his name attached to it in the most literal way. His face on the masthead, his presence at events, his willingness to be the magazine's primary public argument for itself. His career at this stage was inseparable from his public persona, and his public persona was inseparable from his name, which was inseparable from the entire weight of Kennedy mythology. To be John Kennedy Jr. in the mid-1990s was to be always already public, always already significant, always already watched. Carolyn needed privacy for reasons that were, by this point, not simply preference, but something closer to psychological necessity. The years of managing her own image, of controlling what was visible and what was not, had not prepared her for the total loss of that control. They had, if anything, made the loss more acute, because she understood more precisely than most people would have exactly what was being taken and how it was being used. The arguments that were reported by friends, by sources, by the occasional journalist were often about logistics that were proxies for something larger, a public appearance she had agreed to and then found unbearable, a media obligation that bled into what she had understood to be private time, a photographer who had gotten closer than they should have, and John's response, which was measured and calibrated in ways that registered to her as insufficient. These were not arguments about the events themselves. They were arguments in encoded form about whether her needs in the marriage had the same weight as his professional requirements. The Central Park incident, both were photographed and sold to the press appearing in 1996, showing what appeared to be a serious argument between them in a public space, became, in the tabloid narrative, evidence of a troubled marriage. What it actually documented was a couple having an argument in a park, as couples do, in circumstances where a photographer with a long lens happened to be positioned to capture it. The incident was real. What the press made of it, the captions, the analysis, the insertion of the images into a constructed narrative of instability, was something else entirely, a story being written about them that neither of them had authored and neither of them could correct. The magazine continued to publish through 1997 and into 1998, its circulation declining from the peak of its launch enthusiasm, its editorial identity still searching for the consistency that would have made it sustainable beyond the novelty of its founder's name. John continued to work. Carolyn continued to be his wife. The distance between those two activities, and what it meant for both of them, accumulated quietly through the months. In 1997, People magazine named Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy one of the 50 most beautiful people in the world. The citation described her in terms that had become, by that point, almost standardized in the coverage she received. Ethereal, enigmatic, a style icon whose influence on fashion was being felt across the industry. The piece was accompanied by photographs she had not sat for, pulled from the supply of paparazzi images that had been accumulating since the engagement. She gave no comment. Her name appeared in the headline. The magazine sold well. The same year, the New York Post ran a series of items in its gossip column suggesting that she was difficult, that she had few friends in New York's social world, that the marriage was under strain. The items were sourced anonymously, as gossip items are, and their factual basis was impossible to verify. They were read by hundreds of thousands of people and repeated in subsequent coverage by publications that cited the Post as their source, the information laundering itself through successive repetition into something that felt, to casual readers, like established fact. This was the dual machinery that governed Carolyn's public existence in the years between her wedding and her death. Simultaneous idealization and demolition, running in parallel, in different sections of the same newsstands, consuming the same image and producing contradictory conclusions from it. She was beautiful and therefore admirable. She was private and therefore suspicious. She was a Kennedy wife and therefore subject to the specific scrutiny that the press had applied to Kennedy wives for decades, measuring them against a set of expectations that were impossible to meet and convenient to criticize. The tabloid construction of Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy was not a single narrative. It was several narratives operating simultaneously, each selecting different details from the available record and assembling them into a coherent story that served the needs of its particular audience. For the fashion press, she was a style figure. The dress, the hair, the effortless elegance that could be analyzed and replicated and aspired to. For the celebrity gossip press, she was a personality. Difficult, aloof, possibly unhappy, the mystery behind the composure. For the more earnest reaches of the women's magazine world, she was a cautionary tale about the costs of beauty and proximity to power, or alternatively, an inspiration about the possibility of arriving, through talent and intelligence, in extraordinary circumstances. None of these narratives required her participation. None of them were particularly interested in her actual experience. They were stories about a public image, and the public image had long since detached from the person it was drawn from. She understood this. Her friends from the period described conversations in which she discussed the coverage with a kind of exhausted clarity, knowing exactly how the machinery worked. Having spent a decade inside a version of it at Calvin Klein and finding that knowledge useless in the face of being its subject rather than its operator. Understanding how something works does not protect you from it. It may, in certain circumstances, make the experience of being subjected to it more precise and therefore more difficult to bear. The specific claims that circulated about her in this period, that she was isolated, that she had alienated John's friends, that she was struggling with the marriage, exist in a documentary record that is almost entirely composed of anonymous sources and retrospective accounts by people whose proximity to the events in question varied enormously. What can be said with more confidence is that the claims circulated, that they were read widely, and that they shaped the public perception of her in ways that were, by the accounts of people who actually knew her, substantially inaccurate. Her own social world in these years was real and specific. She maintained close friendships and with a small group of people from her Boston years, from her Calvin Klein years, and from the new life she was attempting to build in New York as a married woman of significant public prominence. These friends describe her in the accounts they have given as engaged, funny, emotionally present, a person who remembered things about their lives and asked about them and showed up when it mattered. The isolation the tabloids described was not the isolation her actual friends experienced. What they experienced was someone who had drawn her circle tighter, not because she had become cold or withdrawn, but because the cost of expanding it, under the conditions she was living in, was too high. The fashion world, which she had left professionally but remained connected to socially, tracked her with its own particular attention. She was photographed at shows, she attended occasionally carefully, always in John's orbit or the orbit of people whose company provided a degree of social insulation. Her appearance at any fashion event generated coverage that focused almost entirely on what she was wearing and how she looked. The decade of professional knowledge she had accumulated treated as invisible, irrelevant, a footnote to the story of her appearance. Narciso Rodriguez, whose career the wedding dress had transformed, remained a friend. Other designers sought her out, sent clothes, angled for the association. She navigated this with the same careful attention she had always brought to questions of image, but the navigation was reactive now, managing an attention she had not sought rather than strategically deploying an image she had chosen. The incident that became most widely reported from this period, The Central Park altercation of 1996, captured in photographs and sold, continued to resurface throughout 1997 and 1998, pulled out and republished whenever the tabloid narrative required evidence of marital difficulty. The images showed what they showed. Two people in an argument outdoors, in a city that photographed everything. What the repeated publication of those images was constructing was something more durable, a version of Carolyn as a difficult, volatile presence in a marriage between public figures, a narrative that was easy to consume and impossible to formally correct. She made no public statements about any of it. The silence that had protected her before the engagement now provided no protection at all. It was simply raw material for a press that interpreted absence as confirmation of whatever it had already decided. By 1998, the machinery was fully operational and fully indifferent to her. The beautiful photographs and the damaging gossip items existed in the same ecosystem, serving the same economy, consuming the same person. The composure held in public. The apartment in the West Village received fewer visitors than it once had, and the question of what she wanted, for herself, separate from the marriage, separate from the Kennedy name, separate from the image the press had constructed around her, had no space in the available public record in which to be asked or answered. In the spring of 1996, several months before the wedding, a photographer positioned in Central Park captured a sequence of images of Carolyn and John in what appeared to be a serious argument. The photographs were taken from a distance with a long lens without the knowledge of either subject. They showed physical tension. At one point, John appeared to reach for Carolyn's hand and she pulled away. At another, she appeared to be crying. The sequence was sold, published in a tabloid, and then republished repeatedly over the following years, whenever the narrative of a troubled marriage required visual evidence. The incident was real. The argument was real. What the photographs could not document was its content, its context, or its resolution. The three things that would have made it legible as anything other than a symbol of whatever the press had already decided about them. Arguments in relationships are ordinary. Arguments in relationships under the level of stress that Carolyn and John were managing, the engagement announcement, the sudden total loss of privacy, the press encirclement, the compression of their entire private life into an existence conducted under continuous surveillance, are perhaps not surprising. But the photographs did not show stress and its consequences. They showed two people in conflict, stripped of everything that would make the conflict understandable, and they circulated in that stripped form for years. What was accumulating behind those images in the private life that the press could only photograph from a distance was something more complicated and less dramatic than the tabloid narrative suggested. The accounts of people close to them during this period, friends, colleagues, people who spent real time in their social world, describe a marriage under genuine strain, but strain of a specific and comprehensible kind. Two people with fundamentally different needs trying to build a shared life in circumstances that made meeting either set of needs extremely difficult. John was, by multiple accounts, not indifferent to Carolyn's distress. He was attentive when they were together, aware that the life they were living was costing her more than it was costing him, and genuinely committed to finding adjustments that would make it more bearable. He proposed trips, extended time away from New York, from the photographers, from the social obligations that accumulated around his name. He suggested at various points that they move, that a different city or a different kind of life in New York might provide more insulation. He was, in the language of people who knew them, trying. What he could not do was change the fundamental structure of the problem, because the fundamental structure of the problem was him, or rather the inheritance that came with him, the name and the myth and the public claim on his existence that had been in place for 30 years before Carolyn arrived and would not be renegotiated to accommodate her needs. His trying was genuine and insufficient simultaneously, which is perhaps the most painful combination available to two people in a marriage. Carolyn's response, by the accounts that survive, was to manage, to continue doing what she had always done, which was to control what could be controlled and endure what could not, to maintain the composure in public and absorb the cost of it in private. Her friends described conversations in which she talked about the marriage with a candor that was sharper than anything that appeared in the press coverage. not the generalized unhappiness of a tabloid narrative, but specific and articulate dissatisfaction, with specific conditions that she could name and analyze precisely because she had always been good at naming and analyzing the dynamics of the rooms she was in. She talked about the loss of her career in terms that went beyond the practical inconvenience of unemployment. She talked about it as the loss of an identity, the thing she had built herself, with no inheritance, no family connection, no name that opened doors, but with the skills and intelligence and application of someone who had arrived in New York at 22 with very little and built something real. That thing was gone, not because she had been forced to give it up in any dramatic sense, but because the circumstances of her new life had made it impossible to maintain, and the impossibility had arrived so quickly in the months surrounding the wedding that there had been no time to grieve it before it was simply absent. She talked about the photographers with a weary specificity. Not outrage, which would have been understandable, but something quieter and more corrosive. The accumulated weight of years of being watched without consent, of having her body and her face and her expressions treated as public property, of the particular indignity of being documented continuously in the ordinary moments of a private life, going to the pharmacy, walking to the subway, carrying groceries. These were the moments the photographers sought, because the ordinary moments were the ones that most violently contradicted the icon the press had constructed, and contradiction was commercially valuable. She talked, occasionally, about what she missed, not as nostalgia, not as complaint, but as inventory. The ability to walk in the city without calculation. Lunch with a friend at a restaurant that did not require advanced thought about exits and sight lines. The feeling, which she described in terms that her friends have passed on carefully, of being in a room full of people and being simply one of them, rather than the specific object of everyone's attention. By late 1997 and into 1998, the accounts of people who saw her regularly begin to include details that are harder to read. She was thinner than she had been. The smoking had increased. She was sleeping badly. There were periods, described by friends, when she was difficult to reach. Not unreachable, not vanished, but less available than she had been, as if the energy required to maintain connection was competing with the energy required to simply function. Whether what she was experiencing in this period constitutes something that would now be recognized and named as a clinical condition, anxiety, depression, the documented consequences of chronic stress on sleep and appetite and social engagement, is not something the available record can determine with confidence. What the record shows is a person under sustained and specific pressure, responding to it in ways that the people who loved her found worrying, and that she, characteristically, managed without medical record or public acknowledgement. The marriage did not end. John continued to work on George. Carolyn continued to be present in the life the marriage required of her. The apartment in the West Village held them both in the evenings, in the private space that remained the only space entirely their own. The fractures that the tabloids had constructed as spectacle were real in ways that the tabloids, seeking drama, had failed to accurately document. Quieter, more specific, more humanly complicated than the story the press was telling, and visible only to the people close enough to see them clearly. By the beginning of 1998, Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy had not given a single interview since her marriage. She had not appeared at a public event in a capacity that was hers rather than John's. She had not attached her name to a professional project, a charitable initiative, or any public undertaking that would have given her existence, in the public record, a dimension beyond wife. She was 32 years old, and the entirety of her documented public life consisted of photographs taken without her consent and captions written by people who had never spoken to her. This was not invisibility. She was, in the measurements the celebrity press applied to such things, extremely visible. Her image appeared regularly. Her name circulated continuously. Her appearance at any event generated coverage. But visibility of that kind is not presence. It is the opposite of presence, the continuous documentation of a surface, mistaken for knowledge of what lies beneath it. The withdrawal that her friends described from this period was not dramatic. There was no announced retreat, no public statement, no single moment at which she stepped back from something she had previously been engaged with. It was incremental. the gradual contraction of a life that had always been carefully bounded, drawing inward under pressure until the circle of genuine engagement had become very small. She saw a small number of friends regularly. The apartments of people she trusted, the Boston friends, the handful from Calvin Klein, who had remained genuinely close, the newer friendships she had formed in the years since the wedding, were places she could still be fully present, could still be the person her friends had always known, sharp, funny, attentive, privately warm in ways that no public photograph had ever captured. These gatherings were small by design. They were not photographed. They do not appear in the documentary record except in the recollections of the people who were there. What those people describe is a Carolyn who was, in these private spaces, still fundamentally herself, and who was, outside them, increasingly performing a version of herself that had less and less to do with who she actually was. The gap between the public figure and the private person, which had always existed and which she had always managed with precision, had widened to the point where maintaining it required most of her available energy. She had, by this point, effectively stopped attending the kind of large social events that had once been ordinary features of her professional life. The fashion shows, the industry dinners, the gallery openings, and magazine parties that formed the social infrastructure of the New York world she had once moved through with ease. These were largely gone from her calendar. When she did appear at such events, it was in John's context, as a Kennedy wife, and the experience of attending them in that capacity was, by the accounts of people who accompanied her, fundamentally different from attending them as herself. The difference was not simply about recognition, though she was recognized everywhere and could not move through a room without that recognition reorganizing the room around her. The difference was about purpose. When she had attended these events as a Calvin Klein representative, she had a function, a reason to be there that was professionally legible, that gave her interactions shape and meaning. Now she attended as an adjunct to someone else's function, present because her absence would have generated the kind of press attention that was, paradoxically, easier to manage by showing up than by staying home. She was also in this period navigating the particular social world of the Kennedys with the continuing wariness of an outsider who has been resident long enough to understand the internal dynamics, but not long enough to have been fully absorbed into them. The family gathered regularly, pets, at the compound in Hyannisport, at various members' homes, at the events that the Kennedy name generated as a matter of institutional momentum. Carolyn attended what she was expected to attend and managed these occasions with the social competence she had always had. But the accounts of people who observed her in these settings describe someone who was present in the way a skilled professional is present at an obligation, fully functional and privately elsewhere. John's sister Caroline remained cordial. The extended family was large enough that any individual's relationship with Carolyn was shaped as much by their particular temperament and the frequency of their contact as by any general family attitude. There was no dramatic rejection, no documented hostility. There was something quieter and in its way more difficult. The sensation, which multiple sources have described in various forms, that she had married into a world that had been in formation for half a century, and that had its own internal logic, its own hierarchy of grief and memory and expectation into which she had arrived without the history that would have made that logic comprehensible. At home, in the West Village apartment, the life she and John had built together had a texture that the press never captured and could not have captured. Friends who visited describe an apartment that was theirs in the fullest sense. Not decorated for effect, not organized around performance, but lived in, accumulated, bearing the evidence of two specific people's tastes and habits and daily existence. There were dogs, Friday, a brown and white terrier mix of no particular pedigree, for whose adoption Carolyn had strong feelings, and John affectionate indifference that gradually became attachment. The dogs were walked, the kitchen was used, the television was on. These are unremarkable domestic details, which is precisely why they matter. They represent the version of Carolyn's life that the public record has almost entirely consumed. But the ordinary life of the apartment existed alongside the extraordinary pressure of the life outside it, and by 1998, the pressure had been continuous for long enough that its effects were structural rather than episodic. She was not having a bad year. She was living in conditions that had been consistently, cumulatively difficult for 2 years. with no clear horizon at which they would become less so. Friends who spoke to her in this period have described conversations that moved between the ordinary, gossip, plans, the small shared currency of close friendship, and something more searching, less easy to categorize. She asked questions about other people's lives with an attention that sometimes felt to the people she was asking like more than curiosity. What was it like to have work that was yours? What was it like to walk in the city without thinking about it? What was it like to be recognized for something you had done rather than something you were? The questions were not complaints. They were asked with the same observational precision she had always brought to her understanding of the world around her. But they accumulated, in the accounts of the friends she asked them of, into a portrait of someone taking careful inventory of what was missing, not in despair, but with the particular attention of a person who has always been good at seeing things clearly, and who was now applying that clarity to her own situation, finding what was there and what was not, and sitting with the findings. In the spring of 1999, John F. Kennedy Jr. was making decisions about his future that were, by the accounts of people close to him, more concrete than they had ever been. The Senate seat being vacated by Daniel Patrick Moynihan in New York was the subject of serious private discussion. Not a declared candidacy, not a public commitment, but the kind of sustained internal conversation that precedes both. He had spoken to political advisors. He had spoken to family members. He had spoken, by the accounts of friends, to Carolyn. What Carolyn said in those conversations is not documented in any record that survives. What is documented is the shape of the life that a Senate campaign would have required. The fundraising events, the public appearances, the media exposure, the total subordination of any private existence to the logic of electoral politics, and the fact that she had been living for 3 years with a version of that subordination already, under conditions that had not been easy. A Senate campaign would not have been a new kind of pressure. It would have been the existing pressure, multiplied. George magazine was failing, not dramatically, not with the speed of a publication that had never found an audience, but steadily, in the way that publications fail when their initial concept proves commercially insufficient to sustain the operation. Circulation had declined from the launch peak. Advertisers were reassessing. The editorial staff, which had always been kept together partly by loyalty to John and partly by the genuine belief that the magazine's concept could work, was smaller than it had been. John was aware of the financial situation and was attempting to address it. There were discussions about investment, about restructuring, about whether the magazine could survive in a form different from its original conception. He was managing multiple pressures simultaneously in the spring of 1999, which was not unusual for him. He had spent most of his adult life managing multiple pressures simultaneously, but the combination of the magazine's difficulties, the political considerations, and the ongoing private negotiations of the marriage created a particular density of obligation that his friends noted and remembered later. Carolyn, in the same period, was showing signs of something that the people closest to her have described, in retrospect, with the careful language of people who are aware that what they say will be read as significant. She was, by multiple accounts, thinking about her future in terms that had not been fully audible before, about what she wanted from the next period of her life, about whether the life she was living was sustainable in its current form, about what might change and how. She had spoken to at least one friend about the possibility of returning to some form of professional work. She had spoken separately about travel, extended time away from New York, from the surveillance, from the accumulated weight of 3 years of being watched. Whether these conversations represented a turning point in her thinking about the marriage, or simply the ordinary forward-looking discussions of someone in her mid-30s taking stock, is impossible to determine from the outside. The accounts that survive are fragmentary and filtered through the grief and retrospection of the people who gave them. What they collectively suggest is a person who was neither content nor despairing, but engaged in the ongoing private work of trying to understand her own life clearly enough to make decisions about it. She was 33 years old that spring. Her sister Lauren, with whom she was close, was planning to attend a family event on the Kennedy compound at Hyannis Port in mid-July. The event was a wedding. Rory Kennedy, the youngest of Robert Kennedy's children, was marrying on July 17th. John had committed to attending. The plan, as it developed through late June and early July, was that he would fly. He had obtained his pilot's license in April 1998 and had been building hours in the single-engine Piper Saratoga he co-owned, a plane he had flown increasingly in the preceding months. John's flying was, by the accounts of people who knew him, a source of ongoing concern among those close to him. He had obtained the license relatively recently and had not yet accumulated the experience that the more demanding conditions of instrument flying required. He was not certified for instrument flight rules, the protocols that govern flying in conditions of reduced visibility, which meant that in practical terms he was qualified to fly only when visibility was sufficient to navigate by visual reference to the ground and the horizon. His flight instructor, later interviewed, expressed the concern that he flew with insufficient caution about conditions, that the confidence that served him well in most areas of his life did not translate cleanly to the specific demands of aviation, which punished overconfidence with a reliability that most human endeavors do not. These concerns were expressed to people around John. Whether they were expressed to John himself clearly enough to register is not recorded. The evening of July 16, 1999, was hazy along the eastern seaboard. Not dramatically so. Not the kind of weather that grounds experienced pilots on instrument flight plans, but the kind of hazy summer evening that reduces visibility in subtle ways, that removes the horizon reference points that visual flight depends on, that creates conditions in which an inexperienced pilot can become spatially disoriented without immediate awareness that disorientation has occurred. John had planned to fly to Martha's Vineyard first, to drop Carolyn's sister Lauren, who was accompanying them, before continuing to Hyannisport. The flight from Essex County Airport in New Jersey to Martha's Vineyard was approximately 200 miles, over water for much of the final leg, in the early evening hours when the summer haze was thickest. Carolyn had not wanted to fly. This detail appears in several accounts given by people she had spoken to in the days before the flight, and it is consistent with what her friends describe as a long-standing discomfort with John's flying. Not phobia, not irrationality, but a specific and grounded concern about his experience level relative to the conditions he was willing to attempt. She had expressed this concern before. On the evening of July 16th, she boarded the plane. The precise nature of the conversation between them about the flight, whether she raised her concern again, whether he addressed it, what the emotional texture of those final hours was, is not recorded and cannot be reconstructed. At 9:39 p.m., the plane entered a descending turn over the waters off Martha's Vineyard, from which it did not recover. The plane disappeared from radar at 9:41 p.m. No distress call was recorded. The Piper Saratoga had been descending at a rate that investigators would later describe as consistent with spatial disorientation, the condition in which a pilot, deprived of visual reference points, loses accurate perception of the aircraft's orientation relative to the ground, and in which the body's own sensory information actively contradicts the instruments. The descent was not survivable. The water temperature of the Atlantic off Martha's Vineyard in July is approximately 68 degrees Fahrenheit, which matters for recovery operations and matters for nothing else. John had filed a visual flight rules plan, which required visibility conditions that the evening's haze made marginal. He had declined at Essex County Airport the offer of a flight instructor to accompany him. He had taken off at 8:38 p.m., later than originally planned, which meant the final leg of the flight over the water would occur in darkness as well as haze. The two conditions that most severely limit the visual references that his certification required. These facts were established in the subsequent investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board, which determined the probable cause to be pilot error resulting from spatial disorientation. The investigation's language is clinical, precise, organized around the mechanics of what happened. It does not speak to what the final minutes were like inside the plane, whether there was awareness of what was occurring, whether the disorientation came suddenly or accumulated gradually in the 17 minutes between the last radar contact and the entry into the descending spiral. The NTSB's report, released in July 2000, runs to hundreds of pages and answers the mechanical questions with thoroughness. The human questions it was not designed to address. The plane was reported overdue at 11 p.m. when it failed to arrive at Martha's Vineyard Airport. The Coast Guard was notified. By midnight, The search had begun. Boats in the water off Gay Head, the southwestern tip of Martha's Vineyard, where the radar track had ended. The search area was large and dark, and the water was calm in the way that water is sometimes calm after something has broken its surface, already closing over what it has taken. The news became public the following morning, July 17th, the day of Rory Kennedy's wedding, which was immediately postponed. The coverage that followed was, by the measurements of American media, extraordinary, not in the sense of being disproportionate to the news, because the death of John F. Kennedy, Jr. was objectively significant, but in the sense of being total, continuous, organized, around a grief that was partly genuine and partly performed in the way that public grief for public figures is always partly performed. The feeling real, but the expression of it shaped by the requirements of media and the cultural weight of the Kennedy name. The search continued for 5 days. The bodies of John, Carolyn, and Lauren Bessette were recovered on July 21st from approximately 116 feet of water. They were found in the wreckage of the plane, which had impacted the ocean floor in pieces. The recovery operation was conducted by Navy divers under conditions that the Navy described as difficult: low visibility in the water, significant depth, the wreckage scattered across a substantial area. The coverage of the recovery was itself an event. Cameras on boats offshore, anchors on television providing continuous narration of a search operation about which there was, for extended periods, nothing new to report. The Kennedy family gathered at Hyannis Port. Senator Edward Kennedy made a brief statement. President Clinton ordered Navy assets to assist the search, a decision that was publicly noted and privately resented by some who observed that the resources of the United States military were being deployed for a private citizen because of his last name. Carolyn's family, Kadip, her mother Anne Freeman, her sister Lisa, received less coverage than the Kennedys in those days. This was not remarkable in the context of how the story was being told. It was a Kennedy story, and the Bessette family was peripheral to the Kennedy story in the same way that Carolyn herself had been peripheral to it in life. The coverage focused on John. It focused on the inheritance, the mythology, the accumulated weight of Kennedy loss, the father, the uncle, the cousin dying young, each death folding into a narrative of American tragedy that required the Kennedy name to carry its full meaning. Carolyn appeared in this narrative in the position she had occupied throughout her public life: adjacent, secondary, defined by her relationship to the name she had acquired rather than by anything she had been before or apart from it. The obituaries described her as beautiful. They described the wedding dress. They described the composure. They described briefly and without particular insight the Calvin Klein years. The decade of professional work condensed into a subordinate clause, present tense shifted to past. Some of the coverage, particularly in the fashion press, attempted a different kind of account, one that acknowledged her professional accomplishments, her intelligence, her specific and considerable gifts. These pieces were genuine efforts, written by people who had known her in the industry, who understood that what was being lost was not simply the beautiful woman in the photographs, but a specific and irreplaceable person with a decade of serious work behind her. These pieces existed. They were not the dominant narrative. The dominant narrative was grief for John, with Carolyn and Lauren as its collateral loss, not yet the wife and the sister-in-law, their names always listed after their deaths part of his story, rather than stories of their own. Lauren Bessette, 34 years old, a vice president at Morgan Stanley with a serious professional career and a life entirely her own, received almost no individual coverage. She appeared in headlines as Carolyn's sister, which was accurate and wholly insufficient. At the memorial service held at St. Thomas More Church in Manhattan on July 23rd, Senator Kennedy spoke of John with the weight of a man who had watched the family absorb loss after loss across 4 decades. He mentioned Carolyn. He mentioned Lauren. The service was covered in full by every major network. In the water off Martha's Vineyard, in the days before the recovery, the surface had been flat and unbroken. Whatever had passed through it was gone. Whatever the cameras on the offshore boats were photographing was the absence of the thing they had come to document: the water, the horizon, the summer haze that had been present on the evening of July 16th. And that was, by the time the cameras arrived, already dispersing in the morning air. The estate of Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy was modest by the standards of the world she had inhabited for the final 3 years of her life. She had left Calvin Klein before accumulating the kind of wealth that a full career in her position might have generated. The Kennedy money, substantial as it was in aggregate, was not hers. It was John's, and John's estate, valued at approximately $100 million, was distributed according to a will he had written in 1994, 2 years before the marriage. The will left the bulk of the estate to a charitable foundation, with provisions for family members and close friends. Carolyn was included, but as a contingent beneficiary in terms that reflected the will's age. It had not been updated after the wedding to reflect the new circumstances of a married man. The legal and financial accounting of what she left behind occupied lawyers and courts for months after the crash. These proceedings were not widely covered. They were the administrative residue of a life handled in the language of estates and disbursements, generating paperwork that filed itself in courthouses and produced no photographs. Her personal belongings, the clothing, the furniture of the West Village apartment, the objects she had chosen with the deliberate attention she brought to everything, were distributed among family members and, in some cases, donated. The apartment itself, which she and John had rented, reverted to its landlord. The dogs, Friday and a second terrier named Saturday, were taken in by friends. These details appear in a few brief news items from the months after the crash, the kind of items that newspapers run to close out a story, providing the administrative coda to what had been, for several news cycles, a major event. What did not close out was the public image, the icon the press had constructed, and that continued, in the absence of the person it had been built from, to circulate and accumulate. The wedding photographs were republished on anniversaries. The Rodriguez dress was discussed in retrospectives about fashion in the 1990s. Her name appeared regularly in articles about the Kennedy family, about celebrity culture, about the particular aesthetic of a decade that she had come to represent in the public imagination, without having sought or chosen that representation. Narciso Rodriguez, whose career the dress had transformed, spoke about her with evident affection in subsequent interviews. About her intelligence, her specific eye for design, the friendship that had preceded and exceeded the professional association. These accounts offered glimpses of a person who was not the icon, someone with genuine aesthetic knowledge, with opinions, with the particular competence of someone who had spent years inside the fashion world, understanding it from the inside. The glimpses were real. They were not sufficient to displace the icon, which had been constructed from photographs, and which photographs continued to sustain. The books came within a few years. Several accounts of the Kennedy Jr. relationship were published in the early 2000s, including Michael Bergen's memoir, which devoted substantial attention to his years with Carolyn. Bergen's account was personal and clearly felt, and it introduced into the public record a version of Carolyn that was more specific than anything the press had produced, more human, more complicated, more recognizably a person with an interior life. It was also, inevitably, his account of her, filtered through his own experience, his own feeling, his own perspective on events that she was no longer present to describe from hers. Other accounts followed, some more careful than others, assembling the available record into narratives that varied in their accuracy and in their willingness to acknowledge the limitations of what could be known. The accounts agreed on certain things: her beauty, her intelligence, her social gifts, the difficulty of the life she had lived in her final years, the genuine nature of what she and John had shared, alongside the genuine difficulties of sharing it. They disagreed, or simply differed in emphasis, on the question of what it had all meant, whether she had been happy, whether she had been on the verge of a change, whether the life she was living in the spring of 1999 was sustainable or already in the process of becoming something else. This question, what she would have done, is the one the record cannot answer, and that subsequent accounts have returned to repeatedly, filling the absence with speculation that says more about the speculator than about Carolyn. She was 33 years old. She had, in the accounts of people who knew her that spring, been thinking about her future with more purposefulness than she had in the preceding 2 years. Whether that purposefulness would have translated into action, and what form that action would have taken, belongs to a set of possibilities that closed at 9:41 p.m. on July 16, 1999. Her name has been attached, in the years since, to a particular cultural moment. The 1990s, the minimalist aesthetic, the specific intersection of fashion and celebrity that the decade produced in unusual abundance. She appears on lists of style icons. She appears in retrospectives about the Kennedy family. She appears in discussions of paparazzi culture and the ethics of celebrity coverage, occasionally cited as an example of what sustained and invasive press attention costs its subjects. These appearances are not wrong exactly. She is a legitimate reference point for all of those discussions. But they are citations of an image, not engagements with a person, and the distinction matters in ways that the available record has never fully accounted for. The First African Baptist Church on Cumberland Island, where the wedding was held, still stands. It is a historic site now, visited by people who know what happened there in September 1996. The pews are the same plain wood. The building still has no electricity. Visitors have left flowers occasionally near the entrance. The ordinary human impulse to mark a place where something significant occurred, to make the physical space acknowledge what it witnessed. The island itself is largely unchanged. The ruins of Dungeness, the Carnegie estate at the southern end, continue their slow return to the landscape, the walls standing, the interior open, the vines advancing incrementally across what remains. It is a place that outlasted its own purposes once before, and is in the process of doing so again, the landscape indifferent to what human ambition built and human time dissolved. The water off Martha's Vineyard is the same water it has always been. There are no photographs of Carolyn Bessette that she chose. This is not entirely true. There must have been, somewhere, a personal album, a phone camera's predecessor, a friend's snapshot taken in a kitchen or on a beach with consent and without consequence. But in the public record, in the archive that constitutes what the world knows of her, every image is one she did not authorize, did not compose, did not release. The record of her life is built entirely from evidence gathered without her permission. This is not unusual for women of significant beauty and proximity to power. It is the condition, not the exception. What made Carolyn's version of it particular was that she understood it so precisely, had spent a professional decade on the producing side of exactly this machinery, knew what photographs were for and what they cost and how they circulated and what they erased. She knew, better than almost anyone around her, the gap between the image and the person. And then she lived, for 3 years, inside that gap. On the wrong side of it, unable to close it and unable to stop being aware of its dimensions. What she wanted, for herself, in her own terms, separate from the Kennedy name and the Calvin Klein years and the tabloid construction and the icon the press assembled from her appearance, is genuinely unknown. The record does not contain it. The interviews were never given. The memoir was never written. The professional second act that her friends describe her considering in the spring of 1999 never materialized into anything that could be examined or assessed. What the record contains instead is the image, the dress on Cumberland Island, the composure at 100 events she attended because not attending would have been more costly than attending. The photographs taken through long lenses on ordinary afternoons in the West Village, the subject walking with her head slightly down, aware of the camera and declining to perform for it, which the press read as aloofness and which was simply the only form of refusal available to her. She was 33 years old. She had been publicly known in the sense of being continuously photographed and written about for approximately 3 years. Before that, she had spent a decade doing serious professional work that the public record has never found particularly interesting, and a childhood and young adulthood in which she was simply a person moving through the world, unobserved, accumulating the experiences and the skills and the specific intelligence that would later be reduced, in the coverage of her death, to a physical description and a famous husband. The questions the record leaves open are not answerable and are perhaps not meant to be answered. They are the questions that remain when a person has been consumed by their own public image before they have finished becoming whoever they were going to be. Whether she was happy, whether she would have stayed, whether the purposefulness her friends describe in her final months would have produced something, a return, a departure, a decision of some kind that would have made the next decade of her life legible in retrospect as a beginning rather than an end. She left no account of herself. What remains is what others made of her, which was considerable and which was almost entirely insufficient.